Ethical relativism is a relatively new worldview in terms of the grand scheme of ethics. It's kind of arisen only in the last few decades, actually, but it's become very popular. It's the notion that the rightness or wrongness of an action depends partially upon the beliefs and culture of the person doing the action. And if you're a harder core relativist, you think that it depends exclusively upon the beliefs and culture of the person doing the action. Cultural relativism, for instance, says that an action is good if and only if one's culture says it is good, and likewise for bad. Subjectivism, which I'm calling also individualist relativism, says that what is right or wrong depends on what the individual acting believes to be right or wrong. Okay, it's really hard to interact with a subjectivist relativist. Ethical relativism can be contrasted with ethical objectivism, which says that there is one standard of right or wrong for every person in every culture at every time. That's like a hard line view of ethical objectivism. Okay, taken to an extreme. There aren't really any theorists who are ethical objectivists to that extent, but I'm just trying to make the hardline view kind of just to lay it out there. An example of an ethical objectivist view is natural law theory. Natural law theory stipulates that right and wrong is something that is built into nature because God has, or nature has, built the principles of morality into nature in such a way that ethics obtains within the created order, the natural order. Okay, ethical relativism is also contrasted with situational ethics, which says that the rightness or wrongness of an action depends on the situation in which the action was performed. Relativism says that the same action in the same situation can be right or wrong for different people. Okay, so it's really interesting if you look at studies how people's behaviors are incredibly varied depending on the mood that they're in or depending on the circumstances that they're surrounded by. For instance, apparently, according to the studies, if people have just had a pleasant experience, such as finding a dollar bill or a $20 bill on the sidewalk, or smelling the smell of the scent of a baked loaf of bread, freshly baked loaf of bread in a bakery, they will be more likely to help a little old lady cross a street than they would otherwise be because their mood has become a good one. If people are in a hurry, people are much less likely to do good deeds than they otherwise would be. Lots of studies have been done on this sort of thing. Okay, situational ethics looks at the circumstances in which an agent has been operating and says that the rightness or wrongness of an action depends on the nature of those circumstances. But relativism is a little bit more, a little bit purer form of subjectivity. It says that the same action in the same situation can be right or wrong for different people. One central idea behind cultural relativism is the connection between norm and normal. Each culture has their own set of. In America, for instance, it is normal to drive on the right side and bad or unnormal to drive on the left, but in the UK, of course, the opposite is true. In some cultures, it is normal to burn the dead and wrong to eat them, while in other cultures, it is normal to eat them and bad to burn them. Not in any contemporary cultures. These cultures have mostly been extinguished. Okay, the claim of cultural relativism is that there is nothing deeper to morality than cultural customs we have come to expect of people. Since different cultures have different norms, we should not assume there is one correct norm. So basically, a cultural relativist is going to say that ethics only goes as deep as the consensus within a particular culture. If that cultural consensus happens to be in favor of, say, let me get this out here, in favor of something like driving on a particular side of the road, then that makes that right within that culture, and it becomes wrong not to do so. Ethical relativism does not say that there is a deeper source of our moral values, like nature, or like theistic ethics asserts God as the source of our moral values. Rather, the buck stops here, and all that matters is what the cultural consensus happens to be. There's so many wires up here. In addition to the argument from cultural difference, there also seems to be arguments for relativism from a certain view of tolerance. This is like a different set of arguments in favor of relativism. Cultural relativism seems to celebrate differences as being good and right rather than judging people for being different from us. There's a deep-seated view in current culture that everyone has their own perspective. Because we cannot relate to how other people were raised, we shouldn't judge them. At most, we should only judge those we are closest with and understand best. These are all very common kinds of sensibilities, I think, in the contemporary culture. When I read these off, I'm sure you recognize them as being views that are held by a lot of your peers. Okay, now I want to contrast relativism. I've mentioned that it's contrastable with something like natural law theory. It could also be contrasted with divine command theory. There are a bunch of other non-relativist ethical views out there. Consequentialism. Basically, ethical relativism stands against the whole of the tradition. It's not until the last several decades that relativism has arisen as a view that is held by a large number of people. Most of our ancestors would have considered it to be, quite honestly, insane to be a relativist. They would have considered it madness, impossible to do and be coherent in one's worldview. Ethical objectivism is a reference term for a bunch of different theories then. An objectivist will respond to these claims by noting that different customs does not necessarily indicate an ethical difference. If one culture eats the dead to pay their respects and another culture burns the body to pay their respects, there seems to be a sense in which the underlying ethics of respecting the dead is the same, even if the way they respect the dead is different. So one response that ethical objectivists can give to the fact of cultural differences is that the ideas that are embodied within these cultural differences tend to be the same, regardless of those differences in their practice. Okay, the respect notion is the same, or dignity of the person is the same. Likewise, one could reasonably say that there's nothing ethical about driving on the right or left side of the road. It is ethical, though, not to endanger yourself and others, so it is ethical to follow the local driving customs. But what those customs are is a completely non-ethical issue. So that's arbitrary on the objectivist view, but what's not arbitrary is that one does not endanger oneself or others. What's not arbitrary is the underlying principle that one ought to respect innocent human life and not to take it. Therefore, one ought to follow local driving customs. On the other hand, things with obvious moral status, such as rape or murder, do not seem to vary across cultures in the same way. These are only meant to respond to the case for relativism. There are also massive problems with relativism, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, but basically an ethical objectivist is going to say, so what I'm offering here are two responses that an ethical objectivist would make to relativism. The first is that although practicals differ, still there are some ideas, morally speaking, that are the same across cultures. And the second response is that there are some principles that are not only the same across cultures, even in their practical manifestation, they tend to be the same across cultures. And this seems to be a refutation of the claim of the relativists that this is all just arbitrary, and that ethics is just a construction that we're making up, and that is just arbitrary. You can find prohibitions against deviant sexual activities or the taking of innocent human life in every culture. Okay, I am not a relativist. I find this an incoherent view. I want to offer some problems for relativism. One problem is as follows. Cultural relativism implies that we cannot say any other society's values and norms are better or worse than our own. And this is precisely what defenders of the view like about it. Okay, so you often find very proud cultural relativists saying, I'm not going to judge others in other cultures. And they see this as being a kind of an enlightened perspective that makes them superior because they're able to stand above and beyond their own culture or biases and expectations, and maybe take a supervening perspective that looks down above all cultures and that recognizes in this enlightened way that no culture is superior to any other. Okay, that's why they like this kind of a view. However, this is really difficult to maintain in the face of really terrible cultures. So I basically think it's an incoherent perspective that may provide psychological assurance and a feeling of enlightenment to the people who hold it, but that at the end of the day they do not actually hold. For one thing, I don't think that they hold such a view. And for another, I think that even if they did try to hold such a view, it would become incoherent. Are people who assert cultural relativism really prepared to say that ISIS, right, the radical Islamic organization, raping, crucifying, and beheading people, including children, for not converting to Islam, is a perfectly acceptable and wonderful part of their culture which we should celebrate? And I could run through a litany of examples of cultural practices that are out of control and that are pretty clearly immoral. But the point is that the cultural relativist, although he or she may feel enlightened in asserting relativism, isn't going to come out and say that ISIS is justified in doing this sort of thing. Okay, so it's not something that people actually hold today. And if they did come out and say that ISIS is justified in doing that sort of thing, you'll occasionally maybe find a hard-bitten relativist who will bite the bullet on a topic like that. I don't know what to say to people like that. I don't know. God will spew you out of his mouth or something. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what to say. On the other hand, things with obvious moral status, such as rape or murder, do not seem to vary across cultures in the same way. These are only meant to respond to the case for relativism. Oh, I'm sorry. That slide is a repeat. I apologize. Here's a second problem. Cultural relativism implies that there is no such thing as moral progress or regress within a culture. Right? If cultural relativism is the case, then it's all just arbitrary. There's no such thing as moral improvement or moral backsliding in a particular culture. But this runs into incoherence and also positions that most relativists don't want to take. So again, we find contradictions. When pressed, the relativist always runs quickly into contradictions. For instance, is the U.S. better for having gotten rid of slavery? In order to say that it is better for having gotten rid of slavery, you have to be able to say that one culture, our contemporary one, is better than another culture, that of our ancestors. But this is precisely what cultural relativism denies. Okay, and I suppose on the slavery issue, more people are willing to bite the bullet because it feels historically distant to us. But when a cultural relativist comes out and says that slavery is or was just a justifiable moral practice for the antebellum American South or something like that, it may be a position they can defend in theory, but once you press them and actually list the kinds of practices that were going on, the destruction of human dignity, the damage to basic human rights that was occurring at the time, they tend to waffle and are unable to hold their position sustainably in the face of the quite obvious harm to humans that was taking place. If we could judge one culture as better than another, that would mean that there was some independent standard by which we could judge how good a culture is based on how close it fits that standard, but that is the definition of objectivism. Okay, so a second paradox that cultural relativism runs into is historical cases in which there quite clearly is progress or regress, morally speaking, within a culture. And again, relativists could bite the bullet and assert that no such thing is possible, but at the end of the day, it involves them in contradictions which seem self-evidently to be unsustainable. Okay, here's one response. Some people try to get around this problem by saying that from the perspective of our culture, of course slavery is wrong. We are completely correct. qua relativism to criticize our ancestors because our culture condemns slavery. However, while it is correct for us to say that slavery was wrong, it was also equally correct for Americans, sorry for the typo, 200 years ago to say that abolition was wrong. This doesn't just apply to the slave owners either. Since the slaves were part of a society that condemned abolition, they would have been correct in saying that abolition is wrong and slavery is good. Okay, so you run into all sorts of other further problems if you take this second line of response and say that you can make moral judgments across historical epochs on the basis of what we can do prospectively in our own culture. We don't yet know what way our culture will proceed, so for all we know, it will be good in the future to torture, bully, or otherwise harm people. Given cultural relativism, moral judgments may be correct or incorrect, but this will in no way help us progress as a society. Okay, so that's a second problem. Final problem for cultural relativism. Cultural relativism says that what is good and bad depends on one's culture, but culture is an incredibly vague concept. Okay, so for instance, right now, you are part of American culture, so for you, abortion might be okay, given that it's the law of the land. But you might also be part of Catholic culture, so for you, abortion is wrong. Other cultures you could belong to would be a political party, HBU culture, an academic culture, a global culture, a football culture, etc. There are so many cultures of so many different sizes. Given how many disagree with each other, how is the individual to figure out what is right or wrong for them based on their culture? So the notion of culture is a vague concept. It's incredibly vague, so vague as to offer us no moral guidance at all. What it seems to come down to, this is me speaking, when I talk with relativists, is what culture you want to identify with more. Thus, it seems cultural relativism at the end of the day devolves into subjectivism, mere individual subjectivism, whatever you feel to be right or wrong on a personal basis. Okay, but the third incoherence that ends up paradoxically for cultural relativism is that the notion of culture is just impossibly vague, cannot be sustained as a way of thinking about the rights and wrongs and what kinds of demographics of people and ethnic groups are around us. Let me stop and ask if there are comments or thoughts on this. Yes. You guys speak up a little bit, man. Your mask is like keeping us from hearing you.
What if the relativist or subjectivist says that the idea of subjectivism is that the human culture in general, like the entirety of experiences like that, may build ethical decisions or ethical norms based on what we found over time to be beneficial, such as
Sure. Sure. Rightness or wrongness is a function of humanity as a whole, taking humanity as a whole as a culture. Well, one initial thought, I think that's a great question. One initial thought is that kind of a view would immediately run into problems where different groups of humans radically disagree with each other about certain issues. You can look at historical groups who disagree with us, or we could look at groups these days who disagree with each other. So historically, for instance, there are lots of historical groups who disagree strongly with us about the topic of race. We say today you can't enslave on the basis of race, okay? But peoples in the past might have said something like, well, there's a hierarchical order to nature, and that hierarchical order puts some racial groups higher than others, and so the racial groups that are higher than others are justifiable in enslaving the subordinate racial groups, right? So that seems to be a problem. But we can look today at contrasting groups of people who have serious differences. So, for instance, we say women are fully equal to men in the rights that they possess, in their dignity as human persons, in the kinds of privileges they ought to have in society, including voting, economic, um, social privileges. Okay? But let's go to certain Islamic societies, and again, not all Islamic societies, but some, and a certain number of them are going to say, well, no, they shouldn't have the right to vote. I think that it was only just recently that Saudi gave women the right to drive. So previously they couldn't drive there. Um, and certainly not in a court of law, they ought not to have the same rights as their male counterparts. And they certainly shouldn't be able to be alone with a man, talking with a man who's not their husband, and all sorts of other things that we could point to in the difference, to highlight the differences between certain Islamic cultures and ourselves about the status of women and how women should be treated with what is appropriate respect for women in society. So I think that these two examples, the historical and then the contemporary example, are evidence that if we try to treat humanity as a single, humanity as a single collective culture, then what are we to make of those humans who have fundamental disagreements all the way down about core issues? Right? It seems as though it wouldn't be sustainable. Good question though. Other questions? Cameron. Okay, you got to shout too, because you're talking through a mask as well.
So what's the point of ethics? Because every ethical issue we put over ultimately seems to reduce to a moral issue. So it seems like ethics is just like this drug for people just secretly inserting their moral intuition. So it's like, why call it ethics? Why not just call it whole society structure what's moral?
Right.
Why use ethics? It doesn't seem to happen.
You know, a very famous philosopher would have agreed with you on basically everything you just said, and his name was Friedrich Nietzsche. So Nietzsche said, people use the language of ethics to disguise what's really going on. And what's really going on is they want power over others. So for instance, MLK appeals to the biblical text, and he says, look, the Bible speaks of social justice, justice for peoples. We need to apply the concept of justice in a way that our society does not right now recognize with its segregation ordinances. Okay, fair enough. Nietzsche would have come along had he lived during the 1960s, and he would have said, you know what's really going on? All those civil rights people, they just want power. They want power over others. They speak in the language of social justice, of dignity of humans, respect for others, things like that, but they really want political control. More than they've currently got. They're out of power right now. They want power. But what they are really doing is expressing their preference for power. So Nietzsche actually would have said that all of our language of ethics, all of our rights talk, all of our talk of objective values is a facade. It's a disguise for the will to power, which all of us really have underneath. That's what we really want in life, is power over others. So I don't deny that often in practice, that's what's really going on, and that people are actually using ethical style language as a facade for what they really want, which may be power over others. But the fact that people do that does not demonstrate in and of itself that objective moral values don't exist. Look, the Christian worldview has a terrific explanation for this. The Christian worldview says people are really messed up. They've got this condition called sin. And their sinful condition causes them to mess up, to fumble the underlying morality that God has given to us. We misinterpret it sometimes. Sometimes we intentionally twist it. And sometimes we so foul ourselves up that we don't even know what it says. Okay, and the Christian worldview has a great explanation, I think, for how you can have objective moral values and also humans who regularly use their discussions about and movements about objective moral values for personal gain. So the Christian worldview's explanation is there are objective moral values, and we're sinners, and we mess those values up. And that's why a lot of the time it seems like when we use ethics language, it's really a mask for power. It's because we're sinners. So, one other quick comment on Nietzsche. I was reading not too long ago a passage by Nietzsche, and he said, you know, people use the language of justice and rights and equality and fairness until they get political power. And then they do what they want. But whenever they're out of power, they always use the language of justice and rights and equality and fairness until they get it. And then they just treat the opposition however they please. I thought that was really insightful. I was like, whoa, man, human social movements really do that. That's like incredibly insightful. So although I may disagree with Nietzsche's explanation of things, I find it an incredibly insightful view. Good comments all. Any last comments on ethical relativism?